The first reading is from Acts chapter 16, verses 9 to 15. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. From Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace, and the next day we went on to Neapolis. From there, we travelled to Philippi, a Roman colony, and the leading city of that district of Macedonia, and we stayed there several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshipper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, "come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Please do take your seats. And we're going to think particularly about that reading from Acts chapter 16 together. There are two things on the internet which never fail to make me well up a little bit. One of them is that you can find videos of dogs being reunited with their owners who are in the armed forces. So when their owners come back from a tour of duty abroad, their dogs are waiting for them, and they leap up and cover their owners' faces with their their massive tongues, and it all. The joy of a little dog, or a big dog sometimes, being reunited with their owner just hits something deep inside me. The other thing that always makes me cry a little bit is, it comes around every now and again, people on Facebook share a little sort of line in various forms. The one I read recently went like this: "One day your parents put you down and never picked you up again." So in each of our lives, particularly with our kids, there are sort of last things that you do with them, and at the time you don't realise that you're doing it. You might know the last nappy that you're going to change if you're going to start doing potty training. You might say goodbye to I remember saying goodbye to my mum and dad the time I went to university, and we knew that was a significant moment. But there are other times which are so kind of commonplace. You scoop up your child and give them a cuddle. Now, there was a last time that you do that with your kids, but you don't realise it in the moment. You don't sort of notice it and mark it. It just sort of happens in life. And as I think about that with my own kids, we've already been through some of those last moments. I'm still just about strong enough to pick them up and give them a cuddle. But there are last things that have happened which have gone by without us marking them, and we'll never be able to do again. That's part of the passage of time. Now, why do I say that? Well, in some ways, what we get in Acts chapter 16 is the sort of mirror image of that. Not the last time something happens, but the first time. And yet, in the moment, it wouldn't have seemed all that significant. In Acts chapter 16, we get the first time that the gospel of Jesus Christ goes to Europe, what we now call Europe. If you sort of mark the dividing line, as most people do today, that the Dardanelles and the Aegean Sea. This is the first time that the gospel crosses from Asia into Europe. And looking back from today, that is an enormous moment in world history, because the influence of Christianity on the subsequent development of what we now call Europe, and all those states that particularly followed after the fall of the Roman Empire, the years and years and years that have followed, and the growth of European civilization, inextricably bound up with the impact of Christianity on European culture. And it all began in Acts chapter 16 with Paul and his friends crossing the Dardanelles, crossing the north of the Aegean Sea, and landing in Macedonia and going to this place, Philippi. It's an enormous moment in world history, but at the time you might not have thought so. It wouldn't have made, headline news back in Rome, the superpower of the day. No one would have thought anything of it. As I've been reflecting on this moment here in chapter 16 of Acts, it struck me that it is rich with lessons for us today, both in the broadest sense, as we live, if you like, in the twilight of that European civilization. If you read any of the sort of big histories of the world and the big sort of predictions about the future, the next few centuries are not going to be Europe centuries. The great sort of civilization of Europe is being eclipsed, has been eclipsed already by other parts of the world. And that has, from that sort of massive story, that will have all kinds of implications for us here today and the rest of our lives and the lives of our children and grandchildren. How do we respond to that huge shift that is just happening and has already happened? It happened in the 20th century with the rise of the United States. It's going to happen in the 21st century with the rise of China. We could go on and on. What do we make of our place in the world? But also for us individually, as we live our lives, and maybe like me, you reflect on some of those last moments with your children, if you had them, or you reflect on the way that your life has gone and where it might yet go. Where do we find God in the midst of all that? I think Acts chapter 16 can help us to understand individually, as a church, as a country, as a continent like Europe. And there's two things really that I've been learning from Acts chapter 16 which seem pertinent for us today. The first is this, that God is guiding the big story. If you paint with the broadest brushstrokes, what Acts chapter 16 is showing us is that God is at work guiding the grand narrative, if you like. It's interesting that at the end of chapter 15, we didn't read it, and into the very start of chapter 16, there are two really important things happening for the Apostle Paul. The first is that he falls out with his close friend and colleague in mission, Barnabas. It's a curious moment we don't really talk about very much, but they have a pretty major disagreement and decide to go their own ways, to sort of take off their missionary work in two different directions. It's clearly a moment of sadness, of real grief. You get the impression that there was real bad feeling between them. And what happens at the start of chapter 16, which again we didn't read, is that Paul, setting out on his own now with a new missionary team with him, he starts to encounter frustrations along the way. In two different places, we read that he is being kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. That's chapter 16, verse 6. And then, very next verse, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. Now, put yourselves in his shoes there. He's just made this enormous decision to split from his dear friend and colleague. And as soon as he sets out on his own, things get tough. Things get frustrating. It's not even as if he's kind of being persecuted at this point, which I guess he might be able to make sense of. Well, I expect this. I'm following the footsteps of my Saviour. It's just that his travel plans aren't working out. We're not told the details, but that sense of being kept, being hindered. I think if I were in Paul's shoes at this point, I'd be thinking, have I just made the worst decision of my life? What was I thinking? Splitting from Barnabas. Look, it's all just not working now. Perhaps I might even think, is God punishing me? Is my work here finished? I had a good run in the first few chapters of Acts as Paul came on the scene, but now, well, I'm done. Could be easy to think that, couldn't it? About the sort of state of Christianity in our nation, in our civilization. Are we done? Is the future going to belong to something else other than the gospel of Jesus Christ? Are we destined to be just a smaller and smaller minority without any influence or impact for good on the world? Should we just throw in the towel, dare I say it, as a church, and think, well, shepherd ourselves towards nothing? In our own lives, is it worth it? Is it worth keeping on following Jesus Christ and being one of his disciples? That's why it's so striking that at just the moment for the Apostle Paul, when he's split from his buddy Barnabas, where things are getting frustrated, God is working in a way I think far, far beyond Paul could understand. God is working to bring the gospel to a new place, Europe, and the impact of this, Paul could not get close to getting his head round. In the midst of all that frustration and difficulty and no doubt deep pain, God is at work to do something extraordinary, calling Paul across the Dardanelles to Macedonia and the beginning of the gospel impacting Europe for centuries to follow. And it seems to me that that is precisely what we see God doing time and time again in Scripture and throughout history. Just one example from the 20th century, you might well know this. When Christianity came to China, particularly through the work of Hudson Taylor, and Chinese people started converting to Christianity in enormous numbers, there was a sense of this is a wonderful, amazing work of God. And then the communists came to power and they kicked out all of the Western missionaries. And for years and years and years, people had no idea what was happening with Christianity in China. And the assumption was that the communists would crack down on religion, as they did in places like Russia. And so these fledgling churches, these very young, very small groups of believers that had, sort of bursting with life, would be like that seed that Jesus tells, falling on the shallow soil, spring up quickly and then die. And it was all going to sort of, go to pot. And that was the end of a good work that Hudson Taylor began. When China began to open up more, following Chairman Mao, when Christians could go back in, what they discovered was not a Chinese church that was basically in ruins, but a Chinese church that was stronger than ever. Because with all the Western missionaries being kicked out, Chinese Christians were, if you like, forced into becoming leaders themselves. The leadership of the Chinese church indigenized. And so Christianity in China became even more firmly rooted. Far from stamping out the gospel, the actions of the Communist Party only strengthened the churches, strengthened Christianity. What looked like, I guess similar to what it looked like for Paul, frustration, not the way that we would have done things, turned out to be an enormous blessing. And that is precisely the way that God works. That's his pattern. We see it above all at the cross of Jesus Christ, where even in that very darkest moment, far, far, far darker than the Western missionaries being kicked out of China, far, far darker than Paul and Barnabas falling out and Paul experiencing frustration, here is the Son of God himself, with the powers of this world stamping him out, being rid of him. Precisely at the moment where it looks darkest and most hopeless, that's the very place where God is working. Where God is working salvation beyond any of our ability to understand. God is guiding the big story. He was doing it in Acts. He was doing it at Calvary. And he's still doing it right now. And perhaps you look back in your own life. I can certainly do this and think of all the prayers that God hasn't answered in the way I wanted him to. And for some of them at least, if I go far enough back, I think, wow, am I grateful that God didn't answer that prayer I prayed the way that I wanted him to. Not just when I was a kid and prayed for unlimited sweets and what that would have done to me. But decisions that I've taken where I have prayed for something from God and he hasn't given it to me. And I look back now and I think, gosh, if he'd given what I'd asked for then, I'd be in a hopeless place now. That's just looking back on, say, 10, 15 years ago. Do I really think that I am asking all the right things of God in the present day? I desperately need a God who doesn't give me always what I asked for, but something far, far better and wiser. That's the assurance, if you like, of Acts chapter 16. God is guiding the big story of our lives, of our church, of our world. And secondly, and more briefly, he's not just guiding the big story, he's working in the smallest details as well. Because in response to this clear call from God to cross the Dardanelles, to go into Macedonia, Paul and his new missionary band, his new team, go over and they, if you like, just start wherever they can. In this place, Philippi, they would normally, their habit was to go and find a synagogue and engage Jewish people with the news that their Messiah had come in Jesus Christ, and to try and convince some of them that Jesus was someone worth paying attention to. Philippi doesn't have a synagogue, clearly. Synagogues had to have 10 Jewish men to be able to form. So Paul and his companions go to the place where Jews and sort of people on the margins of Judaism, people who wanted to be part of the sort of Jewish group, would have gone to pray, down by the river. In many ways, it looks like a piddly little strategy. Go and find this little group of people. But that's where it begins. That's where the conversion of Europe begins. This lady in particular, Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth, clearly a woman of some means, clearly perhaps what's known as a God-fearer, wanted to be associated with the God of the Jews, although not herself Jewish. And all that Paul does is find this little group of people and starts to share with them that Jesus Christ was who he said he was, that he really came and lived and died and rose again, and life's available in his name. On its own terms, that is both a very sensible strategy and a complete waste of time, if not for the fact that God opens Lydia's heart. That's the language that Luke, the writer, uses. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. So all those little details about Paul and his companions crossing the sea, Luke seems to have a bit of a thing for he likes to know where they're going, in what boats and what the wind's doing. All the little details there, and all the little details about going to this place of prayer and finding this little group of people, that all matters in the way that God works. Those aren't kind of irrelevant. They all matter. All that strategy, if you like, matters. Because God shows up and works in that one lady's heart. She becomes, I think, her house. She's clearly a woman of means, and she becomes like the church meets in her house in Philippi. But because God opens that one lady's heart at that little meeting by the riverbank, the course of history is changed. Luke clearly sees all this in hindsight. At the time, I guess it would have just looked like, well, we were just guessing, finding our way, praying, waiting. We didn't know if we were doing it right. And even in hindsight, Luke can't see the grandeur of what's going on fully. But as we face a future as Europe, as the UK, as this church family here, as individuals, a future that is uncertain. We don't know where God will be leading us next. Acts 16 shows us he's working in the big story and he's working in the details. And therefore we can trust him. And we can commit to follow him and be obedient to where he is calling us to go. And we can know that, however treacherous the path might look at times, he is leading us for good. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, put it like this: how then shall we face the future? When the sailor is out on the ocean, when everything is changing all around him, when the waves are born and die, he does not stare down into the waves because they are changing. He looks up at the stars. Why? Because they are faithful. They have the same location now that they had for our ancestors and will have for generations to come. How much more, rather than looking at the waves, can we look up at our God, who is faithful to the very end, who is unchanging, and who is sovereign over the biggest and the smallest details. It's his unchanging faithfulness that meant that Jesus Christ came in the flesh, whose supper we will celebrate together in just a few moments. And with that deep assurance, not only that God never changes, that his love for us never changes, we face our futures. We can face our futures with a confidence like nothing else in the world. Let's be quiet for a few moments and reflect on these things further, and then Nick will lead us in the rest of our service.